Hello and welcome to the Linux Spotlight. This show is dedicated to showing off the best thing about Linux, our community. This community is made up of developers, distro maintainers, YouTube personalities, and everyday users. Each one plays a vital role in our community. And the goal is to have a discussion with each individual about their journey into Linux and beyond. So join me now as we turn the spotlight on. Hello, I'm your host Rocco, and I am so excited to get to introduce our special guest today, Elizabeth K. Joseph. How are you, Liz?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Awesome. Thank you for joining me today.
Thanks.
Well, we got introduced from mutual friends, and I had done some research on your bio, and if I spent the whole show listing out everything that's in your bio, it would probably take up the whole show. Just to name a few, you have your own Ubuntu wiki page, which I think is the ultimate. You know, if you got an Ubuntu wiki page, you made it. I'm just teasing. You have a bio on the Women's Media Center.com, and you won the O'Reilly Open Source Award for 2012. And I'm going to read this because I was not familiar with this. But this award is presented to individuals for dedication, innovation, leadership, and outstanding contribution to open source. That speaks for itself.
Yeah, it was quite an honor.
That is awesome. Above all of that, who is Elizabeth K. Joseph personally?
Yeah, so I love Linux.
Yep.
I got into open source software less because of the open sourceness or open sourciness, and more because of you could customize everything, and you could open up a little C program and make some tweaks and change things. And fundamentally, I am a tinkerer, and I love playing around with things and seeing how they work. And that sort of spreads out to all aspects of my life. I enjoy playing with model railroads, and I enjoy driving, and I enjoy taking trains, and I enjoy all kinds of mechanical things in addition to my computer hobbies. So
very nice.
Kind of open sources and getting to play with computers is kind of core to who I am. And don't tell my boss, but I totally work for free because I love working in open source communities and being involved in all that. So.
Well, you've worked for some high profile companies. You were an automation tools engineer for HP, and now you currently work for IBM on Mainframes, and yeah. I guess some people still refer to them as Big Iron, but yeah. Tell us about your job.
Yeah, so I sort of got into the industry, what was it, in I think 2002. I was doing web development because that was kind of the easy thing to do. For me at the time. I'm one of those girls who had a Neopets website, and I had an Angel Fire website. So there was MySpace and all that stuff. So you were playing with HTML all the time. So that sort of morphed into a job. And then I started working as a Linux systems administrator. And that was for a small company in Philadelphia where I was living at the time. And at the time when they hired me, it was a small company, and they needed someone who would do Linux or programming or sort of whatever I wanted to do with my career. And that's where I started falling in love with Linux systems administration. So to bring to your actual question about what I'm doing today, I was brought into the mainframe team at IBM because I've been working in Linux infrastructure for about 15 years. And that's a long time for someone to be working in this.
That is a long time.
And even though I've mostly been working on x86, I've played with Spark, and I've played with MIPS and a few other alternate architectures, of course, like Raspberry Pi's ARM.
Right.
But I wasn't familiar at all with mainframes. So when IBM reached out and said, "Hey, you want to work on mainframes?" I'm like, no. Right. But they talked me into it. And now I started at the end of April, so a few months in now, and it's a fascinating space. So what I do is I'm a developer advocate. So I get to spend all my time learning lots of things about how you can run Linux on mainframes and then sharing that with people like me who didn't know it. Like I was working for a Silicon Valley startup most recently. And when we talked about our infrastructure, it was like on-prem x86 or cloud-based x86. Those were the only options out there. So I'm now telling people that there is another on-prem offering, and also there's mainframes in the IBM cloud. So,
well, you recently gave a talk on the history of Linux on mainframes.
Right.
So can you give us like the short version of it?
Yeah, absolutely. So Linux has been running on mainframes for about 20 years. The first sort of prototype of Linux on the mainframe was put together by a community member. So it wasn't someone at IBM. There's this great website of the founder of the project. He put together a list of reasons why you would want to run Linux on the mainframe. And the first 4 reasons are totally familiar to Linux hobbyists. They're like, because like bragging rights, because it was there.
Right.
Because, like these like nerdy like reasons, like there was, there's like that old joke of like, we're going to put Linux on everything, like including the dead badger.
Yep.
Okay. Also the mainframe, like you should just put Linux on everything because you can and it's fun. And then there's like 4 more reasons that are like, like there's actual like IO benefits and business value and blah, boring things, right?
Right.
Things that IBM pays attention to, it turns out. But it was started as a hobbyist project. And it was 1999 that IBM jumped on board, like a year later. And they started quietly doing development. So in the end of 1999, they released a bunch of packages for, I think, the 2.2.14 kernel. It wasn't mainline, but like they just had like some blobs and said, hey, if you load these kernel modules and put it on mainframe, you can run Linux in the ZVM virtualization layer.
Right.
So that sort of began IBM's journey. And there's like all these, okay, I'm going to say it, cheesy commercials from IBM at the time about Linux on Z. And they're super fun. Maybe if you have show notes or something, we can share a link to one of them. But
yep, absolutely.
Talking about like consolidation of resources. You don't have to have a whole room full of computers. You can just use one mainframe. And that was kind of their story. Of course, it's evolved since then. So in the intervening years, you're now able to run Linux instead of in the VM space. You can run it on what they call bare metal, which uses the mainframe tooling called Prism, PR/SM, which is the same thing they run ZOS on. So you can run Linux natively just like you run ZOS. But honestly, most people still use VM, the ZVM technology, because it offers pure isolation. You can get more Linux boxes on the mainframe and have still the amount of isolation that you'd want through the mainframe technologies. And just recently, you can also use KVM as your virtualization technology. So you don't even have to use ZVM. You can use KVM, and then you can use libvirt, and you can deploy VMs on your mainframe using something like OpenStack. And there's a lot of open source tooling that has come to Linux on the mainframe. So.
Well, I think it's awesome because, sometimes me personally, I'll get tunnel vision and think that, Linux is pretty much on the desktop only. And it's like so much more than the desktop, from the servers in the cloud to point of sale services to mainframes at IBM. Yeah. So in your experience, how does business react to Linux on a whole?
So it's funny, when I started my first job as a Linux systems administrator, we gave this, it's like a business seminar in Philadelphia, and we brought like our biggest customers and biggest potential customers, and we did a daytime presentation. It's like a whole day of various presentations about open source. And I will say Philadelphia tends to lag behind a bit. Like I think Google had already been using Linux for like, as long as they existed. So Silicon Valley was starting to understand Linux and open source, but in Philadelphia in 2008, hadn't quite caught on.
Nah.
So we did presentations, and looking back at the list of presentations, it's so funny because one of them is like the business value of open source software. And I'm like, wow, like every single business in the world is now building their infrastructure on open source software. So, even 11 years ago, that was a question. Like, can you build a service? And another one was like, using open source software to build your web application. And again, like that's what every Silicon Valley startup is doing right now.
Yep.
They're building apps and web apps and things, built open source software and Linux. And then I also did like, what is open source software? So like really easy. So that was 11 years ago. And now today, it is essentially table stakes for most companies. If it's not open source, they're not even going to consider it. I worked at a container company before this, a startup in San Francisco, and they open sourced their products specifically because it was one of the customer asks. They said, if you don't open source this, we're not going to use it. And so it was a big thing. They open sourced their product. And
wow.
So Linux sort of falls in the same realm as just open source generally. It's what everyone uses on their core infrastructure at this point. And I noticed a switch also, like when I first had a Linux sysadmin job, the job descriptions were Linux systems administrator or systems administrator, which meant Windows.
Right.
That is completely swapped. If you're looking for a systems job, if it's a Linux systems job, they're going to assume Linux. And now if you want a Windows, it's Windows systems administration.
Wow. So. That's awesome.
Yeah.
All right. So do you have a secret plan in place to install Linux on all of the computers at IBM? And if not, why?
It's actually pretty surprising how many people are using Macs at IBM.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, when I joined, I was given the option. I had 3 options for the laptop I could get. I could get Windows, Mac, or Linux. So Linux is supported as a first-class citizen. So I've got Red Hat Enterprise Linux 7.6 running on my work laptop.
That's awesome.
So and it's nice because everything, like even we still use Lotus Notes, so that was already installed, and we had like the company VPN was already installed, and if I have a problem, I can call the IT help desk, and they have a Linux option, even if they pronounce Linux oddly in the help system.
Well, Linux is full of that, so
yeah. It's actually been a really good experience so far, and I'm a huge proponent of Linux. And one of the things I learned upon joining IBM is they're actually a really good open source citizen. So they do a really good job at open source. They have a whole open source training system where it's written, I think, for people who are new to open source,
right.
Like the rules around open source, and how we can write source code and we can release it without a huge barrier, which is really nice.
Well, I think that's awesome because, like I said, you get tunnel vision, and there's a lot of people that like run Linux on their computer daily, but don't ever hear about stories like this. So,
yeah.
All right. So before we get deep into the Linux desktop, what was the first computer you touched?
So my family didn't have a ton of money growing up, so I didn't have a computer till it was still early. So I was born in 1981. So the first computer I had was around 1990. So I had just probably turned 10 years old or so, 91. And my uncle, who had started a job at IBM, in fact,
nice,
shipped up an 8086, which is the first personal computer.
Right.
And so I worked on that with DOS and WordPerfect, and it was text only. And that is where we had for about 2 years. I wrote a lot of stories on it. I played a lot of Zork. And this is the time when like graphical interface, like Windows 3.1 existed. I just didn't have it at my house.
Well, okay. So you didn't have it at your house, but everybody has like their first stories of where they heard Linux. So, you go from that computer to playing around with like Zork, and then where do you hear the word Linux at?
That's a really good question. So when I was in high school, I didn't have access to the internet. So this was, the late 90s. It hadn't really come up to Maine where I was living yet. We had pockets of internet. They sort of had access in the library at school, but it wasn't really a thing.
Right.
So I pretty much lived in the dark until I got internet at home when I was a senior in high school in 1999. And I accidentally joined an IRC network. So I'm a big sci-fi fan.
Right.
And I happened to join the sci-fi.com Java chat on their website because, sci-fi.com, that's cool.
Right.
So I joined that. And then after a couple of months, people were like, you should stop joining through the web interface. You should join through the IRC client. And that was like, what does that mean? So I ended up on IRC. And that just changed everything, because I learned about other IRC networks, and then I started joining other IRC networks, and I started talking to a lot of nerds.
Right.
And computer people. And that is essentially where I started meeting people and learning about Linux. So the person, one of the people I met on the Sci-Fi network, he ended up being a Linux systems administrator, and he lived in Philadelphia. And so I came to visit, and he was running Linux on his computer, and that's when I saw it. So it was really the people I ran into on the Sci-Fi network who were Linux nerds already.
Awesome.
And it was all online. Yeah.
So where do you go from hearing about it, visiting that person, seeing Linux, and saying, I want to try this on my computer?
So when I first saw it, I was like, this is really cool. But I wasn't quite ready to make the change. So I installed Lightstep on Windows. I think it was Lightstep. It's an alternative shell for Windows.
Really?
From like 1,000 years ago. And that's sort of my first taste of modifying my system. And then it actually took moving in with a boyfriend who was running Linux on his machine. So he helped me get it installed. My first install was a dual boot with Windows 2000. And then for a while he was managing my system for like a year. And then he switched to Gen 2. So we were using Debian, and he switched to Gen 2. And I started playing with my system by myself, and then he wasn't upgrading it anymore. And I'm like, come on, my computer is broken. He's like, well, you got to fix it. So I stopped using Gen 2.
Right.
First, I started using binary packages for everything in Gen 2. And I'm like, why am I doing this? I should just switch back to Debian. So when I switched back to Debian, the boyfriend's like, I'm not doing your computer anymore. I'm full on Gen 2 now. I'm like, okay.
He's past all that, huh?
So I was Debian from there on out, and I managed my own system, and then I discovered Ubuntu a couple of years later. So.
All right. So you didn't have any reservations on trying it. You just jumped right in and did it.
Yeah. And along the way, I had a lot of help. In addition to my boyfriend, we were living in Philadelphia, and I was going to the Linux users group there, and they were super friendly, and I got really close with a lot of them, and it was a really fun experience because it was just a really great, tight-knit hobbyist group who had a lot of fun together. And I remember the first meeting I went to, it was about herd Linux, and I understood nothing.
That's the way it is.
It was like a professor who had this fleet of machines at the university, and I was just like, wow, I have no idea what the words you're using are, but it was pretty fun anyway.
I felt like that at Self sometimes when people were giving talks. So all right. Everybody has their own experience that first time that you try Linux. You have good things about it that you like, and you have pretty much some bad things about it, especially back in that time because there were hard things. So give us some pros and cons to that first experience you had.
Yes, I think the best thing about it was, coming from the Windows world, even if I was using an alternate shell that I could change a bit. When I came to Linux, I realized I could change everything about my environment. And I think my favorite experience, I was using Enlightenment. Enlightenment was my first desktop environment. And that was because of my boyfriend, because he was using it and he was super minimalist. So he set me up with a desktop that had no icons and no menus. It was just the background. And I had to right click to launch a menu, and there were key bindings. But, one would think that was a terrible way to be introduced. But for me, that was the perfect way to be introduced because it made me minimalist for the rest of my Linux life.
Nice.
But anyways, that's how it started. And then there was this little ePlit when Enlightenment had ePlits. It was a little dashboard thing. So once I ended up getting a little dashboard, I can't remember, it was for weather or time or something, but it wasn't doing what I wanted to do. So that's when I discovered open source, essentially. So one of my friends showed me how to find the source code, open it up. It's a .c file. I don't know C, but right. I was able to figure it out, what I needed to change. I was able to edit that C file, change. I think it was a spacing issue. It was something really ridiculous and tiny that I needed to change. It wasn't anything complicated. I was able to recompile the software and then put that on my machine. And then the little ePlit worked exactly the way I wanted it. And that I was like 3 months into my Linux journey before I compiled my own C program, and that was like transformational. This is amazing.
Not hard, but I don't think many users, even 3 months in, are going to open up their dot files and start editing it and actually making the fix. So
it was, I mean, I had help obviously. But it was really something. So that was like an awesome experience. The less awesome experience was one of the hardest things about the systems then was upgrading anything. So you run, apt get upgrade, and sometimes things break really horribly. Sometimes the computer won't boot, sometimes Wi-Fi stops working, sometimes video stops working. So and then when I moved to Gentoo, it was even worse, because this was the age of like stage 1 installs of Gentoo, which means you bootstrapped everything compiling wise. And I remember getting really familiar with the Gentoo forums, because every time I would upgrade my system, something would break. I'd go to the forums and find the fix, and then I'd come back and fix it on my machine. It was really annoying when it was networking that broke, though.
Yep. Networking has been a pain since the very beginning.
That is for sure. So I think just like the constant breakage, and people make the joke that people switch to Ubuntu because networking Wi-Fi worked rather than Debian, and that was totally this time.
Right.
Ubuntu broke less, which was really nice.
Yep. So did you stay with, you made the jump to Linux? Did you stay with it, or did you switch back to Windows for a little while? Or
I was using both for a while. I had a dual boot system, and I think I wrote a blog post about when I dropped Windows, but I realized I hadn't booted into Windows for several months. And part of it was I used to play games on my computer, but I had pretty much switched only to console gaming. So I was really just on my PlayStation or whatever, and that's how I was playing with my friends. And I wasn't even playing video games on my computer anymore. And that was kind of the last holdout for switching full-time to Linux. So I realized I hadn't booted into a while. We needed some more space on my hard drive. And I'm like, all right, there goes Windows. And this was,
wow,
I think it was like 2007 maybe. And so I've used exclusively Linux longer than any other operating system at this point, like by far.
So you don't have any Windows machines anymore?
No. I had one because I was doing Ubuntu project testing, and one of the tests is to change your partition size and squeeze out Windows. But at some point in the testing, because I'm testing alpha releases of Ubuntu, right? At some point, I think I overwrote my recovery partition, so Windows just went wobbly, and I just never brought it back. So
nice. Well, you mentioned gaming, and gaming is like that one holdout for a lot of people. And I don't know, for me, I still dual boot Windows. Okay, because there are certain games that I want to play and that's the only reason I dual boot Windows. I may boot into it once or twice a week to play a game, but other than that,
and I won't say it's been completely smoothless with regards to games. My husband, he's a total nerd as well, and he loves computers, but he uses Macs because that's what he uses at work, and that's what he's comfortable with. And he was tired of things breaking, and he likes Mac hardware, whatever. So sometimes we want to play games, and so we have to find a game that works on Mac and Linux so we can play together.
Yeah.
And it, with Steam and things now, it's a bit easier, but it's not super easy. We were trying. I can't remember. It was like a RTS game or something. We just wanted to find one that worked both on Linux and Mac.
Right.
We got really close, but then we brought it up, and the graphics were all kind of a mess on Linux. I'm like, this doesn't look like it's supposed to look. He's like, no, that's so super broken.
Do you have a favorite game you play or did play?
So not any. Okay, so I just bought I don't play on my computer anymore. So I just bought a Switch recently, actually last year. So the Zelda game on that is glorious. So.
Nice.
But I also I just had a son, my first child, in January. So I now
congratulations.
Nothing. Thank you. I haven't played a game probably in 6 months. I mean, since he was born, essentially.
Yeah. Well, that takes up a little bit of time.
It does. Yeah.
So on your personal computer at home, do you have just one distro desktop environment, or do you hop around to different ones?
I don't hop.
Come on.
No, I run Ubuntu pretty much on everything, and I contribute to the Ubuntu project, so I run the Twitter account for Ubuntu, and I was just added as an owner to the Reddit Ubuntu thing. I don't use Reddit, so I don't know what I'm talking about, but this like the Ubuntu Reddit thing, because that's part of our social media. Someone else is going to actually run it, but I do a bit of work for the Ubuntu team, so I'm pretty invested in it, and I'm also one of the authors of the official Ubuntu book, so I'm all pretty much in with Ubuntu and Ubuntu. Yep. Except on servers, I run Debian.
So, what was it about Ubuntu that made you pick that one to say that's what I want to run?
I picked it because it's the XFCE distribution, and so after Enlightenment, So Enlightenment, there was this time when Enlightenment 14 was going to come out any minute now, and that was like, it never came out. It eventually came out, but it took years. And I was tired of waiting because E13 was fine, but like the other window managers and desktop environments were catching up. So I switched to Fluxbox and I don't know, there was a bunch of boxes I tried.
Yep.
And then I landed on XFCE because I think it was Fluxbox changed the config files like twice in a couple of years. And I had been writing all of my key bindings in their config file. So I think they were like in XML, and then they switched to another format, and it was infuriating because I had written all my key bindings in those formats. So I like rage quit Fluxbox. And I was like, I'm just going to use XFCE. And XFCE had this really beautiful blend of being a lightweight desktop environment, but also allowing you to do lots of things with the mouse. So I could set up all my key bindings, I could change my menu items, I could do all kinds of things just through the graphical interface. And I wouldn't have to worry about the underlying config files changing ever again.
Right.
I'm just configuring things through the GUI, and that was just easier for me. So I used XFCE on Debian, and then I was installing the XFCE package on Ubuntu, and then eventually I'm like, oh, I should just run Ubuntu because that's the thing that I want. Right. And Ubuntu is effectively like the default XFCE distribution at this point.
Yep, absolutely. Well, XFCE is fantastic. I'm sorry. Yeah. It's not, what I run, but I know from running it before that it's fantastic.
Yeah.
So what is your daily workflow like as far as like software that you need to have installed on your machine to do your daily job?
Right. So I always, when I'm working, so I work from home most of the time. I do have an office down at the Silicon Valley IBM lab that I go into to meet with colleagues and stuff regularly. But for my day-to-day work, I'm at home. And so I have a Linux desktop running Ubuntu and on one monitor, and that's my personal computer. So I do all my personal stuff on there. And there's also, since I work on open source for my job, and I have for a very long time, I use my personal account for a lot of things. So even though I've got my personal desktop up and my personal GitHub profile and accounts, everything is up. And then like the mailing list. So when I subscribe to an open source mailing list, I'm not using my IBM address, I'm using my personal address because that's how I interact with the community. Because then I change jobs and I still have that continuity of who I am in the community. Right. So I'm not goofing off my personal desktop. I have that up because I actually have work on that side in the open source. And then I have my laptop that I have from work, and that's again like the Red Hat distro laptop that work provided for me up on its own monitor. And then the applications I use every day, it's pretty much Chrome or Firefox, depending on which way the winds are blowing. And then lots of terminals because I'm SSH'd into places. Yep. And then I tend to use LibreOffice for presentations and things I do, unless I have to collaborate with someone. And then I'll either use Google Docs or like the hosted box thing that work uses. And then I'm just like looking at my panel now of like things I have, like what am I using? Okay, I use GIMP all the time. Like yep. I use that for creating presentation stuff. And then usually present from Events, the PDF reader. Yeah, those are pretty much my core ones. And so, I'm on IRC all the time, so I use IRC and Screen.
Well, I recently got into IRC, and I mean, I've been running Linux for years and just never got into IRC for whatever reason, and recently got into it. So yeah, that's pretty cool. Which IRC client do you use?
IRC, IRSSI.
Oh, that's what. Oh, you just said that. Yeah. Okay.
No.
All right. Is there any software that's not currently available in Linux that you would want to see come to Linux?
That's a good question. I don't think so specifically. I would like to see a lot more support for, like, default support for cross-platform things, because sometimes so my husband's working on this home automation system, and so he's like totally geeking out about it all. And some of the components he gets, he's like, we don't have a Linux computer or a Windows computer, do we? Because like the only way to configure this is if I load it up on Windows and run the application, and that's a little infuriating. And so we've tried running some of this stuff in Wine, and it doesn't work so well because it's usually like hardware level connections that it needs, and Wine, is great, but it's not perfect for that kind of thing.
Right.
So I think a world where cross-platform application development was more common would be where I want to be. And it's possible with languages like Python and Go, even Java. Like Java is how they used to do it. So
right.
It'd be nice to have more applications that would just run everywhere.
Well, I think we're headed in the right direction in that sense, but we're still not quite there where we need to be. So
yeah. And they're getting used to it by offering options for Mac, because more and more people are using Mac. And then once you're supporting two platforms, you're already using some sort of language that's going to be cross-compatible. So.
Now, do you find that, especially in that realm, as far as developing software, do you find that Linux having so much fragmentation or so many distros out there is holding that back a little bit?
I think if you asked the application developers, they'd say yes. But I don't know if that's actually just an excuse. And it is hard because, a Linux distribution is supported for 5 or 6 years at most, and
right.
Things move pretty quickly. And that's fast for an application developer. And it can be hard to install like an older version of Python or whatnot on a new distribution.
Yeah, I think if we could convince people that Linux users it would benefit them to develop for Linux, we would be in a better place. I just don't know how we go about convincing them of that. So
yeah, it's tough. And I think we're also seeing an interesting manifestation of this in the Canonical versus gaming kerfuffle that recently came about with 32-bit support being dropped.
Yep.
Is not only were game developers not writing things in the latest language, they weren't even writing things in the latest architecture. And it was astonishing to me that they were still compiling everything in 32-bit. And I guess I understand they wanted to support things older, and 64-bit is backwards compatible, but it's been a while.
Yeah, I mean, like anything under 10 years is probably going to be 64-bit. So
yeah. I mean, so one of the things I do is I work with a nonprofit in San Francisco that puts Linux-based computers into like community centers and schools and things. And we take donated computers, so they're often older. Even we've made the switch to 64-bit. Like we haven't had a 32-bit computer in our infrastructure in probably 4 years. Wow. So even the little tiny nonprofit that is taking donated computers is using 64-bit.
Well, let's get into that, because we're going to get into the community end of it. But so tell us about this nonprofit thing.
Right. So it's called Partum As, which they tell me means we share in Latin, but I don't know anything about Latin, so I just take it. So Partum As.
Sounds good, right?
We spend a lot of time in public charter schools in San Francisco, but bureaucracy in schools is complicated. So I think we're only in one school right now. I'm sort of out of the loop with this like new child thing.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
But I know last August they were doing a lot of work in getting into another school. But we also put computers in low-income housing facilities in San Francisco. So people who are homeless or rebuilding their lives, and they're in this low-income housing place. They have access to computers now because we were able to bring some Linux-based computers in. We're using Ubuntu on those because Ubuntu is lighter weight.
Right.
And so in each, I think we have 6 facilities, and we've got about 2 computers in each one of them. So they use the guest account on Ubuntu, and so every time someone logs in, they just have a fresh environment, and they can every job pretty much requires you to apply online these days.
Yep.
For a lot of government benefits and things, you need the internet. And astonishingly, a lot of this stuff is not mobile enabled. So you go to these California government websites and you can't use them on your phone. You can barely use them on your desktop, honestly. But
Right.
So having a computer is really, really important for these people in order to rebuild their lives and get access to services and jobs and other things. So it's something I'm really happy that we're doing, because not only I was really excited to work in schools, but now helping adults really come back into the workforce and get what they need done. And we happen to be doing it with Linux because
I think that's awesome. I mean, these are stories that people don't hear all the time. You know, like you get okay, you mentioned about the 32-bit problem and everybody was flipping out and we're all bickering back and forth of what's going to happen and everything. And that shouldn't even be our focus. This type of stuff should be our focus because it's so awesome to be able to give that to somebody.
Yeah.
Because it is something that's needed. You know, you mentioned about the online jobs and stuff like that. It's true. You have to apply online. You have to do a lot of this stuff online. And yeah, that is amazing.
Yeah.
Well, your list of community stuff that you've been involved with is like really long. So you've been an Ubuntu member since 2007. You were on the Ubuntu board membership 2008 to 2012. The Ubuntu Council 3 terms from 2009 to 2015. You were coordinator for the Philadelphia Linux User Group, the Bay Area Linux User Group, editor for the Ubuntu Weekly newsletter.
For a long time, that was.
I mean, and that's not even everything. I mean, everybody should go and look at your bio, especially on the Women's Media Center. It has so much information on it. What is it that drives your love for the community or for Linux in general? So, I mean, a part of it goes back to just my natural interest in tinkering with things and having an enjoyment for working on Linux. Another part of it is related to the work that I do with Partum As, is I believe when we look at like the 4 software freedoms, I believe in that really strongly. I think people should have the ability to modify the software they use. I think equal access to technology is incredibly important, because these things are so essential to our lives these days. The internet is essential to our everyday lives in ways that I don't think we could have ever anticipated 20 years ago. And it's becoming increasingly important to have equal access to technology. And one of the things I did it was 2013, I worked with a nonprofit in Pittsburgh who was working with an NGO in Ghana, which is in Western Africa. So we flew over there and worked with the NGO to teach them how to install Linux with the Linux drivers for printers and all kinds of things in order so they could take computers that we shipped over in a container and then install them all around Ghana in schools for kids. And that was incredibly satisfying. Yes, absolutely awesome.
Yeah, and partially because it wasn't us going and fixing things for people. It was us training the trainers. So we went in, and when they had questions about Linux, and we had this relationship going on, for a long time after we left too. But we were on the ground working with them and saying, like, this is how you install these things. This is how you support the machines. And it was bringing technology to people who hadn't previously been able to experience, and learning about their culture and their communities. And it was a fascinating time for me, and I feel like we made a real difference, and that was really important. Yep.
Well, that's what it's all about. It's about making a difference in people's lives, and when you can use Linux to do that, that's like a perfect pair there.
Yeah.
So you've been around Linux for a long time. In your experience, I know there are horror stories everywhere about the community itself, but how have you found the community in general, maybe back when you first started up till now?
It's definitely been mixed. And I think I wouldn't say Linux is worse than the rest of technology in my career. I mean, part of it is I've always had this really strong support network of friends who were into Linux. And so from the time I started, when I had that boyfriend, and then I had a Linux users group that was really accepting, up until working with the Ubuntu community, they were incredibly friendly, and they were open to me pointing out when there were problems. So as you mentioned, I was on the Ubuntu Community Council for about 6 years. And in that time, there were some really big schisms in the community for Ubuntu. And Canonical made some really big mistakes.
Yep.
And I mean, look, creating Unity, getting rid of Unity, like those those are bad times.
Yes, those are bad times.
So in general, the community has been actually really, really welcoming and interesting for me. There hasn't really been a time where I felt like I'm quitting, I'm out of this. There's definitely been frustration points, especially when things get personal. You know, being on the Ubuntu Community Council, there were times when we had to kick people out of the project. There were times when we had to get involved very personally. Yep. And, you know, it's easy to say, you know, this is for the betterment of the community, and getting rid of toxic people is incredibly important. But on a personal level, that can be really hard. So I think the key for me generally has just been having a supportive network of people. When something goes wrong, when you have an incident with someone or something is difficult, having people who are supportive, who you can reach out to and talk to. But mostly I've had really good experiences.
Well, everybody is different as far as what experiences they've had, but what can we do as a community to make that better for people who are just coming to Linux?
I think that this has been something that a lot of communities have covered already. I think one of the things that Ubuntu did was introducing the Ubuntu Code of Conduct, which we may forget. Ubuntu was the first project to have one. And it was incredibly important to Mark Shuttleworth's vision of having a civil community that worked really well together. And even though if we look at, we did a revision of the Ubuntu Code of Conduct when I was part of the community council. And even now it's starting to look a little dated, because you've got these people, like you have consultants now who run their business around writing code of conducts. Right. They have evolved considerably in that time. But I think code of conducts that have things like, don't be condescending to newcomers, always assume the best intent, and just generally being kind and respectful to one another. Just following the tenets of these guidelines that are brought into place, I think made Linux, and especially Ubuntu, a much more welcoming place than some Linux distributions before it. And I think all of them sort of came into line with the way Ubuntu is. I mean, Arch Linux is incredibly welcoming and friendly community. Their wiki is, legendary. Yep. That's just people helping people.
Right. So are you able to talk to people around you, like in daily life, about Linux and not have them look at you like you're crazy? Because I don't usually have that experience. I usually have people looking at me like I'm crazy.
I mean, it depends on, I have a lot of geeky friends. So my friends, they're fine. My family, I don't know. They think I just work on magical things. One member of my family thought the cloud was in satellites. I don't blame him for thinking that. Hey,
it's all new, right?
But one of the ways I approach it, though, is because Linux is so pervasive in the corporate world and in the internet world, is I say, when you go to a website, the thing that makes that website go is Linux. And I give examples. Netflix. Everyone loves Netflix.
Right.
Amazon, like Yahoo, Google, like every one of these sites. The thing I work on is the thing that makes those sites go. And that's when they understand it.
Right.
And I honestly, you mentioned like you think a lot about the Linux desktop. I actually think very little about the Linux desktop. It's great, but in my day-to-day work, it's all about servers.
Right. Well, see, this is why, like, there seems to be a gap in communities. Like, there are communities inside of communities. So there are Linux communities as far as people who help develop software. There are people who are YouTubers in Linux. There are people that just, will be in a Telegram group. And sometimes I think there's a disconnect between all of them. And this is exactly why I want to talk to people like you, because you bring stories to life to where those people don't have any idea that that's going on. And I think it's pretty awesome.
And I think even a perfect example of my own life is I had no idea about the mainframe community 6 months ago, but now that's what I do.
And there you go. All right, so you've done everything from documentation to helping maintain packages. You worked on, I think it is Debian Ledger SMB?
SQL Ledger, yeah.
SQL Ledger. All right, so what was your favorite project to work on in Linux?
My favorite project was Biddleby.
What is that?
So, okay, well, Ubuntu holds a special place in my heart. It probably is my favorite, but reaching back into time, Biddleby was an instant messenger gateway for IRC. It still exists. It now supports things like Twitter and Facebook chat, I think it supports. It uses libpurple to hook into a bunch of different protocols. But at the time, it was a way to get your AOL Instant Messenger and your ICQ and all these messages into IRC. So your consolidated client for instant messaging and IRC was your IRC client. And for me, as this big IRC head, like that was a thing. So when I started using it, I think I started using it in 2005 or 2006. And it was one of the first open source projects where I joined the channel for the open source project, like the IRC channel. Right. And I sort of just lurked there for a while. And I think about a month into my spending time there, the leader of the project, a guy named Wilmer, he said, our quick start is terrible. Someone needs to rewrite it. I was like, the quick start is how you get the documentation for how you get started. And it's inside of Biddleby. So you type like quick start 1 and it gives you like inside of the IRC client, it gives you a bunch of instructions on like how to add your first account, instant messaging account and whatnot. So I was like, oh, how hard could that be? Okay.
That's a bad thing to ask.
So, immediately I was like, oh, I think I can do that. Like I can write documentation. Okay. So first of all, it's not easy to write documentation. Secondly, it was written in DocBook, which I had never used before. I think they were using CVS at the time as their revision control system. But honestly, I just sent the patch to Wilmer. I'm like, here, Wilmer, here's the new quick start. I don't know how to use your proto Git.
Right.
So, it was hard. My quick start ended up being like 50% longer than the original quick start because I wanted to add stuff. And he's like, this isn't really a quick start anymore, but it's fine. And so like at the end of this little process where I had my name in the changelog for the first time ever for an open source project. And that was the most satisfying thing ever. And I ended up staying in the Biddleby channel and I still use Biddleby in my IRC client today. And I met Wilmer because my husband was working at Google and Wilmer joined Google and he was visiting the campus in Mountain View. And I was like, hey, we should meet up. So the three of us got together and I met the founder of the open source project. That was the first one I ever contributed to. And we've met up since then. Like we bump into each other at conferences sometimes. And I still sit in the IRC channel and help people out with whatever connection issues they're having. And that one, it was just special because it's such a niche thing. It's a weird little project and it's got just a tiny number of contributors, but we're all pretty close.
Yep. Well, you mentioned about getting to meet him. And recently I got to attend Self and people I talk to every day in Linux, I got to meet from all over the world. And it was absolutely awesome. That is like one awesome thing that can happen. So,
yeah. And I work for IBM and there was a certain acquisition that happened recently. IBM bought Red Hat. And so I tweeted the other day, I was like, I'm really excited to have all these new colleagues, join, suddenly.
A small company, right?
Suddenly Red Hat's part of IBM, so I have all those new colleagues. But honestly, like these people who are at Red Hat, they've been my colleagues for years. We move around to different companies, but we're all still in the same open source community. And sometimes I forget what company people are working for. I'm like, where are you now? Okay, I'll see you at the next call.
That's why you keep that personal email.
Exactly, because I need to be able to move around and but it's really amazing, like the bonds you build in these open source communities, and they end up being really personal. Like I've stayed on my friends' couches before. Sometimes if I'm visiting a city, I'll meet up with someone I've never met before, and I've known them in IRC for 5 years. It's fine, never had a problem, and it's really exciting to have friends all over the world. And if I happen to be in some city, for Ubuntu especially, Ubuntu used to have a lot of local teams. So what I would do when I was visiting somewhere is I'd hop on their mailing list and I'd say, hey, I'm going to be in town. Anyone want to go out for beer or have an Ubuntu hour or just meet up? And I met a lot of really cool people that way.
Yep. Well, when we were down at Self, we had, there was 4 of us, Michael, Ryan, and Zeb and me, and we went out to Waffle House. And it was like we knew each other all our lives almost. That's just the feeling that you got. And these are just relationships that you build over time.
Yeah.
So, Well,
And I think that's what keeps me really strongly involved. I mean, I love the technology and I love helping people, but I've got friends here.
yep. Where do you think Linux is headed as far as in the broad scheme of things? Are we headed for the year of the Linux desktop, as they say, or will it be relegated to just like being on the business side of things?
I mean, one of the things I've noticed recently, looking at my own family especially, is I'm thinking we're heading, if we haven't hit it already, I think we're headed to the year of no desktop. My family has mostly switched to using their phone for everything. Everything is mobile. Most things are mobile enabled these days. And, I got my family Chromebooks a while back because I couldn't support Windows or Linux remotely. They live far away from me.
Right.
So it was hard to support them. So I'm like, I just have Chromebooks. And they use them. But day-to-day stuff, it's all about their phones. Also, my experience when I was in Ghana, everyone there uses their phones for everything. We were putting computers in schools because using a computer was a valuable business school for students to know and understand and be familiar with. But for day-to-day use, it's all about the phones. The good news is the phones run Linux. So we won. But there really has been like the demise of the desktop in general. They are used at companies still, but a lot of those are switching to dumb terminals as well. I mean, things like Chromebooks, where another win because those are Linux too.
Right.
But everything's done on the web, even at companies. So like the last couple of companies I worked at, my work laptop doesn't really have stuff on it. I use webmail. I use I create some of my presentations on Google Docs or whatnot. I mean, I don't keep much on my desktop itself. It's all on the web or on a server somewhere that I'm running.
Right.
And I need a desktop for my work, but a lot of people don't. So what I've seen, is Linux moving to Chromebooks and it's going to Android, and the industry's using it still a ton. Like all the fastest supercomputers in the world are running Linux, but I don't have numbers, but I have a gut feeling that the number of Linux desktop users has gone down.
Well, you mentioned about the Chromebooks, but a lot of the schools and whatnot are running Chromebooks. And, I can't say that I want to hear that the desktop is going to kind of fade out, but who knows what's going to happen. I don't know.
And that's one of the things we ran into with the nonprofit we're working on too, is we realized that our Linux boxes that we were releasing were essentially Chromebooks. Like we were working really hard to optimize Firefox to run, Flash at the time and Java and everything really, really well, because the students were just using web apps for everything. And then for our really powerful computers, when they want to do video editing, we did want the desktop, because things like video editing and a lot of those things you can't really do effectively online.
Right.
But when they were replaced with Chromebooks, it wasn't like, we sort of saw that coming. We were like, listen, like our entire Linux experience is now based around Firefox. So it's not a big surprise that they're going to switch to those.
Yeah. Well, if you could change one thing about Linux, what would it be?
I think it would be the community of the Linux kernel. They've seen significant improvements over the past few years, and there was a big admission from Linus last fall about how things may be a bit too abrasive and his role in that. And I don't know the motivations behind that or anything, but I think it was a really good step in the right direction, because Linux kernel development has been something that only people either who were paid to do it and had support of their company and people inside of their company who could support them for their patches and things, or people with really tough skins.
Right.
I think that was an unfortunate situation, because I think a lot of people who wanted to get involved, like I never considered Linux kernel development. Like I've done so many things, but that was something I would never do because I knew how hostile the environment was. So the path on making it better is something I'm really excited about. And I probably never will get involved with Linux kernel development, but I want it like me 10 years ago. I wish I had that opportunity, and I wish things had been better at the time.
Right.
So I think just improvements in community is really a big deal, because having been involved with Ubuntu, Ubuntu definitely had some superior technology, and Canonical made some really, really good decisions about ease of use and things. But I think it was the community that really made Ubuntu take off the way it did in the beginning.
Yep. Well, you mentioned about the Linux kernel, and you may not ever develop on the Linux kernel, but you want the opportunity to do it, to be there, or at least the environment to be open enough to be there. So, Michael Tennell, who is a friend of mine, gave a talk itself about how bad Linux is at marketing itself. Do you agree with that it's pretty bad at marketing itself, and can we do things better?
It really is. And I think like the best marketing material I've seen for Linux has been developed by companies, not just, the Red Hats and the Canonicals of the world, but, the IBMs and the HPs, because they realized that there's something really here and they put real marketing money there. I think that's the only way that it's going to happen. I think organizations like the Linux Foundation could do a lot better because that's, part of what like promoting Linux is part of their mandate. But at the same time, I mean, it's really taken off in the business world, and most servers run Linux. And so it kind of depends on what you're trying to market to.
Well, Microsoft put out a video of the terminal and made it look awesome. And it's just the terminal. And they made it look so cool. I guess that's what I'm talking about. Like, where is that in the Linux world? Like, why are we not doing that ourselves?
I mean, I think part of it is we just don't have the expertise. There's not a lot of marketing people joining open source communities. And I'm technically the marketing lead for Ubuntu. And I joke, but it's not a joke, that I'm the marketing lead because I know how to use Twitter. And we have a web developer who does the website, and he makes things look pretty. Like, he does web development professionally for his job, so he can make a website. But when it comes to like content plans and actual marketing, we don't know what we're doing. Like, we're technologists. If you had asked me to make a website, it's not going to be pretty. Yeah. So I think, just we're a bunch of nerds and we don't know how to make pretty things.
Well, see, I always say about myself, I can't create nothing. Like, if I tried to create a website, it would look terrible. I can tell you what's wrong with a website and why it doesn't look good, but I can't create one myself. So.
Yeah. So one of the things I'm really excited about this team I joined at IBM for IBM Z is that we have a really diverse team with regards to skill sets. Mm-hmm. So we're building this community portal that's launching in a couple of weeks, and the guy who's building it is really good at making pretty things. Right. So he can be, he can show me this website and be like, okay, Liz, like, add the technical bits here, and what should I talk about here? And he just makes everything look pretty, and it's gorgeous. And I was like, wow, that really pops and impresses me. And I could never do something like that. So I think bringing in and appreciating alternate types of talent in your community is incredibly important. It's something we've not done a good job in a lot of communities of appreciating the artists and the documentation writers and everyone who actually makes Linux usable and interesting.
Yep. I think it would go a long way. Brian, my friend, said that if everybody would just at least say thank you for developers and the software you use. And I would, say, hey, just donate something, whether it be money, time, effort, an email to a developer saying how much you enjoy the software. Yeah. Anything would go a long way.
Yeah, I mean, and it can be interesting because you sort of think of software as this black box that just magically appears on your computer, but there are real people behind that, and a kind word, like every time someone says something nice about Ubuntu on social media, if they tag at Ubuntu and I actually see it, I pass that along to the developers because I'm like, hey, you're actually appreciated, because some days are really hard, especially when it's crunch time and you're getting ready for a release and no one's tested the ISO and we're like, where are our testers? Why isn't anyone helping us out with this? I'm going to give up. Like, when you're at that moment where you're so stressed and like the deadline is coming, like it's really great to see the community there of users and people. So like, even saying thank you, like that can be the difference between like the maintainer finishing their work for that night or not.
Well, talking to Sean Davis, and he told us everything that he does and puts into it, and what the other parts of the team do. Mm-hmm. There is so much work involved in putting out a distribution, especially the size of Ubuntu. Yeah. And I guess what I'm saying is I want people to put forward how much they appreciate that work.
Yeah.
So,
And not just complain, because we get enough of that.
Well, I mean, sometimes that's pretty, it seems like sometimes that's all you get is the complaints. And I think that's just true of people in general, where you tend to say something when it's wrong and you don't really say anything when it's right. So,
yeah.
All right. So thinking about all of the reasons you chose to use Linux, do they still apply today?
Yeah, absolutely. Pretty much all of them. It's still fun to tinker with. I can still play around with things. I will say, like, I don't customize my desktop as much as I used to. I'm not recompiling little applets anymore. But I know I can.
Well, that's the key. But like, I have a desktop, and like, I've hopped to every distribution possible out there. But right now I run one distribution on my desktop, and then I have a separate computer for trying out distros. So that way I have a main machine that's stable and not going to change. And then I have the other machine to do whatever I want with it. Yeah. Check out all the new distros. So is there anything else you want to share with people? Maybe what you're doing next? Because you're always doing something.
Yeah, so I mean, right now my trajectory pretty much is focused on work and all this mainframe stuff, because I came into this as a Linux expert, and I have a lot to learn about mainframes themselves. And as a technologist in general, like I may have landed on Linux and open source, but I love computers. So I think my biggest next journey is going to be learning a lot more about mainframe technology, because it turns out they still run the world.
Yep. Your
banks, your healthcare, your flights, like, if mainframes went away, we would have a big mess on our hands. So I think for me, like, a big thing is not only learning it for myself, but also sharing the knowledge and bringing that to other people. I've submitted a few talks to conferences that are upcoming this year about Linux on the mainframe. And that digs into some of the history. And it's fascinating stuff. Like, the first operating system I learned recently was developed in the 1950s by the community. And IBM was like, oh, an operating system seems like a good idea. And they took it and, brought it in. And that was the first operating system that IBM ever had. It was something that's community developed. So there's this group called Share, and it's the oldest user group in the world as far as computers, founded in 1956, I think. And they still have conferences. They have a conference in Pittsburgh next month.
Wow.
So, like, learning about the history and, like, getting deep into this computer stuff. And maybe my next phase will not be, like, super Linux focused, but it's still, like, infrastructure technology that I'm really excited about. And I'm always going to pull it back to Linux, because that's where I am.
Because reasons. So how can people get in touch with you?
So I'm on Twitter, PLeia2, like Princess Leia. And then my website is princessleia.com. So you can find me on my website. I got links to my email address and all that on there. So I'm happy to chat with people. I'm not the best with email at the moment, because, again, I have a 6-month-old baby. So things may be a bit delayed. But I love chatting with people and meeting with people. So
nice
to reach out, especially if you're a newcomer and you watch this and you were like, oh, I don't know how to get involved. I'm always happy to take a few minutes and say, like, well, what are you interested in? And let's see if we can find the right place for you.
Helping people out.
Yeah.
That's what it's all about. All right. That's it for our discussion. It went by like that. Thank you so much, Liz, for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you all for joining us this week as we spotlight the best thing about Linux, our community. Until next time, long live Linux.